The following podcast is by Mr. Jim Koewler, elder law and special needs attorney, helping and protecting those who need long-term care. And welcome everyone back to Answers for Elders Radio Network, here with Jim Koewler, elder law attorney extraordinaire. And Jim,
I don't know the extraordinaire part, but thank you.
I love talking to you. So
I think of it as elder law attorney full of hot air, but okay.
We have talked a lot about, obviously, the spend down, and I'm really glad we also talked about the fact of thinking about it in advance. So when that time happens, you've got your ducks in a row, and that's for a single person. But now we're going to talk about married people. That's a total different story, isn't it?
Yes. Well, I won't say a total different story, but it is a different story.
Okay.
It builds on what happens with a single person. Okay. It's a modification what happens with a single person. Okay. So one, they must be married. Some states recognize common law marriage. Some states do not. They have to be married. They're living together. They've been sharing expenses, but they're not married. No benefits. The well partner doesn't get anything, any of the benefits I'm going to be talking about. Okay. So the second important point is the income of the well spouse does not get to be used by Medicaid to pay the expenses of the ill spouse. So what we're looking at is whether the well spouse, what Medicaid calls the community spouse, even though the ill spouse, who's called an institutionalized spouse, may not be institutionalized because they may be staying home.
Right.
Okay. But it's still community spouse and institutionalized spouse, because that goes back to the basics of Medicaid for long-term care being nursing home and nothing else, because at the time that Medicaid was created for long-term care, there was nursing home and nothing else. So that terminology has followed through all the decades, even though not every institutionalized spouse is in fact institutionalized. Okay. So the community spouse's income is not available to pay the costs of care under the Medicaid rules for the institutionalized spouse. Okay, for the ill spouse. That doesn't mean a nursing home may not try.
Right.
Okay. Because if people don't know better, the nursing home can hoodwink them into it, then they'll take it. Okay. They're, even if they're not for profit, they don't want to be money losing. Mm-hmm. And those that are for profit obviously want to be making a profit.
Right.
So they aren't above some underhandedness and not being clear with spouses that they don't have to pay. Okay. But under Medicaid rules, the well spouses, the community spouses income, remember we're talking about income, what comes in each month and gets spent, that wasn't there before. Income does not have to be spent on the ill spouse, also called the institutionalized spouse. So that's the second big tenet. Okay. So let's assume though that the institutionalized spouse has more income than the community spouse. That's where things get complicated and can be generous, maybe too strong a word, but the ill spouse may have to give some of his or her income to the institutionalized spouse to use. It's not a physically, here, honey, here's your money thing.
No.
But in the Medicaid calculations, it works out that way.
Well, and it can, I know, like with my father, I'm thinking about with my father. My father had the assets. My stepmother was 20 some years younger than him.
Good for your father. Yeah.
Huh? Yeah.
Good for your father.
I know. So, but he had the assets, right? So that I remember he set up like a family trust that was also upon his death, there was certain resources that he had, life insurance policies, all that stuff went into an irrevocable trust. But he was never on Medicaid, but she ended up eventually going on Medicaid. But that was a whole other, because his was frozen, but there was a clause in there that said he had to pay so much on catastrophic illness. It had to come out of the trust. So I don't know. That was, I'm sure that's kind of what you're talking about, right?
Yes and no, because that was assets were, how resources, now you got me doing it, how resources were set up by your father and stepmother by their attorney as part of an estate plan.
Yeah.
It may have built into it a long-term care plan, but as part of an estate plan. Okay. And remember, now we're simply talking about money that arrives every month. We're focusing in this segment on income.
Okay.
So what your father and stepmother may have set aside among their wealth, that's not income. So let's say they did this and your father did in fact need long-term care. I realize that's not the case, but just taking him as an example, since you brought him up, dad did in fact need long-term care. And since because he had more of the assets, he probably also had higher income during his working life, and therefore probably had higher income during retirement. Okay. So as the spouse with the higher income, he might have had to share some of that income, even on Medicaid, with your stepmom. Okay. Now, granted, he was going to either pay it to his care provider, the nursing home or assisted living, and as opposed to his wife. Okay. So it didn't cost him anything. He ends up the same place financially.
Right.
But she does not. Okay. So back when we were talking about resources, I talked about below a certain number, about $260,000, the well spouse gets to keep half of the resources. Okay. What I'm talking about income is related to that. It's under the federal program of avoiding spousal impoverishment. Big fancy word for making, we're not going to make the community spouse broke. Okay. So as part of the avoidance of spousal impoverishment or spousal impoverishment protections, the well spouse got to keep roughly half of the resources.
Wow.
But then when we look at income, we aren't looking at half and half, by the way. We're looking at the income needs of the well spouse.
Got it.
First of all, there's a certain minimum amount based on the cost of living. And I don't think it's the same from state to state. So I'm not going to say it's based on the federal poverty level, but there is a number based on the cost of living. It's probably uniform among the middle of the country states, but the higher income, the higher cost states, the New Yorks, the Washingtons, the Californias, they probably have a different number. And it's around $2,300 a month here in the middle of America. Okay.
Right.
If the well spouse doesn't, and I'm just going to make the husband the one in the nursing home, because the women have driven us crazy, and I can make
we live longer.
Joke. Yeah, I can make a sexist joke. Sorry. And I'm not going to pick on guys. Come on, I'm a guy. So the husband's in the nursing home, the wife is at home, and he's the well spouse, at least the better off of the two, doesn't yet need long-term care. Her income isn't $2,300 by itself. Gross, by the way. You have to add in her Medicare add back in her Medicare Part B premium that's taken out for Social Security, add in taxes if she has a pension, that sort of thing. Okay. Gross it up. And if her income isn't yet $2,300, she gets to get some of the income from the husband each month to get her up to $2,300. In addition, if her housing costs, or what we call shelter costs,
right?
Medicaid calls shelter costs, they're still housing costs, are higher than, making air quotes, average,
right?
She may get to take more. Okay, there is a certain amount of expected shelter cost, and that really needs to be state specific, or in your Californias, it may be region specific. Okay, right. It costs this much to house a person. And if again, I'm just going to make the husband the one who's in the nursing home. If the wife's housing costs are higher than that standard number, then she gets to take additional income to fill in that gap between her actual housing costs and her income. Between her actual housing costs and the standard housing rate expectation. Sure. It's kind of like the standard deduction with your taxes. There's just a number that's assumed. Okay. Right. So that's what the housing cost is. As part of the shelter costs, utilities are included. And because utilities fluctuate from month to month based on the price of oil, based on whether it's summer or winter, the states have an assumed number. Again, I believe it's state specific assumed number that if you spend $1, or if you spend a penny on utilities, then they simply assume that you spend this much. In Ohio, it's like $553. Okay. So if you spend a penny on electricity and don't spend on anything else, no gas, no water, no sewer, but you spend a penny on electricity, then it's assumed that you spent $553 on utilities. So you're, and then let's say the standard housing deduction, I should have looked up these numbers before we got on and I didn't. Let's say the standard housing expectation is $700. And that's, I'm pretty close in Ohio, by the way.
Right.
So there's a $147 difference there. Okay. So if your insurance, your real estate taxes, your homeowner's fees, and if you have one, a mortgage, add up to more than $147 on top of you paid anything for utilities, you're now at the standard number. So anything above that standard number, you get to take out of the community, out of the ill spouses, the institutionalized spouses' income each month to avoid spousal impoverishment. Now that is if someone stays on Medicaid, you know, past the renewal date, you know, up to the annual renewal date, that's recalculated. They look at those things. They don't look at anything else of the spouse's income except how are you compared to the national standard? Okay, they aren't looking at the spouse's wealth at that point. If the spouse hit the lottery, the community spouse hit the lottery and has $1 million, doesn't matter. Those are resources.
Right.
Okay. So they look at the well spouse's income. How does it compare to the standard in that area, including the current housing, the shelter cost standard, including within that the current utilities expected number. I guess we call it a standard, but it's hard to think of it as a standard. And then the homeowner's fees, real estate taxes, mortgage, and insurance, and recalculate the month what the income share, which we call monthly income allowance.
And Jim and I are going to be right back, everyone, in the next segment.
State of Ohio residents, you have a friend to help you navigate long-term care while protecting your assets. You can reach Jim at www.protectingseniors.com or just email him at jkoewler-afe, that's jkoewler-afe at protectingseniors.com.